Welcome to Africa Untold. When we think of inventions that shaped the modern world, most people name European geniuses: Galileo, Da Vinci, Newton, Watt, Edison. But what if I told you that behind many of the greatest ideas, the science, the medicine, the technology, stood Africa, a continent whose discoveries were stolen, renamed, and buried under colonial lies? From ancient engineering in Egypt to surgical tools in Nubia, from mathematics in Mali to astronomy in Ethiopia, Africa was never a dark continent. It was a continent of light, invention, and brilliance. Yet history textbooks taught us to forget. This is the story of the African inventions Europe claimed as their own, and once you hear it, you'll never look at history the same way again. Long before Europe's so-called Age of Enlightenment, Africans were experimenting with science, architecture, medicine, and navigation. The pyramids of Egypt were not just tombs. They were complex mathematical, astronomical, and engineering projects. In West Africa, the Noak civilization created iron smelting as early as 1000 BC, centuries before it appeared in Europe. In Sudan, archaeologists discovered 2,500-year-old astronomical sites older than proving Africans were mapping the stars with precision. But colonial scholars called Africa primitive. Why? Because acknowledging African inventions would destroy the myth of European superiority. Mathematics, the so-called universal language, owes much of its foundation to Africa. On the banks of the Nile, Egyptians invented geometry to measure land after floods. The Rhind mathematical papyrus around 1650 BC contains problems in algebra, geometry, and fractions that Europe wouldn't rediscover for millennia. In Ethiopia, the ancient Ishango bone, dating back 20,000 years, contains notches that show advanced multiplication and division. Some historians call it the world's first calculator. Yet textbooks often credit Greece as the birthplace of mathematics. The truth: Greek philosophers studied in Egypt, borrowing directly from African knowledge. Did you know the first recorded surgery was performed in Africa? Ancient Egyptian papyri describe brain surgery, dental fillings, and prosthetic toes. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, 1600 BC, lists diagnostic methods that resemble modern clinical practice. In Nubia, archaeologists found traces of tetracycline, an antibiotic, in 2,000-year-old bones. Africans were producing medicine through fermentation long before penicillin was discovered in Europe. Even the practice of vaccination, which Europe credits to Edward Jenner in the 18th century, has African roots. Enslaved Africans brought knowledge of smallpox inoculation to the Americas, saving countless lives. Iron smelting revolutionized warfare, agriculture, and trade, and Africa was among the first. In Tanzania's Lake Victoria region, furnaces from 2,000 years ago reached temperatures higher than those achieved in Europe centuries later. In Nigeria, the Noack culture forged tools and weapons that reshaped their society. Their terracotta sculptures reveal mastery not only in art but in materials, engineering. Meanwhile, across the Sahara, African builders created suspension bridges, stone cities, and irrigation systems that dazzled Arab and European travelers. But colonial narratives erased these achievements, reducing Africa to mud huts in Western imagination. When European sailors set out on voyages of discovery, they relied heavily on astronomical charts, many of which had African roots. In Mali, the Dogon people possessed knowledge of Sirius, the dog star, including its invisible companion star, centuries before Western telescopes confirmed it. In ancient Egypt, priests tracked planetary movements and used them to create the calendar still guiding us today. The Nabd Playa site in southern Egypt, built over 7,000 years ago, aligned with the summer solstice and Orion's belt, evidence of advanced stargazing long before Stonehenge. But when Europe built its own observatories, African starlore was dismissed as myth. Look at Europe's Gothic cathedrals and you'll see arches, domes, and courtyards designs that originated in Africa. The city of Great Zimbabwe, 11th–15th century, contained massive stone enclosures built without mortar, rivaling any medieval European fortress. In Egypt and Nubia, obelisks stood as engineering marvels. Later copied and installed in Rome, Paris, London, and New York. Even Spain's Alhambra, celebrated as a jewel of Islamic architecture, carries deep African roots through Moorish innovations that blended mathematics, design, and beauty. Before Europe began farming efficiently, Africa was experimenting with irrigation and crop rotation. Ancient Egyptians designed the shadoof, an irrigation device still used today. In the Sahel, Africans domesticated crops like millet, sorghum, and yams, feeding millions long before Europe imported potatoes or corn. Coffee, one of the world's most valuable crops, originated in Ethiopia. Palm oil, now a global industry, was cultivated in West Africa. Even bananas and rice were spread worldwide through African trade routes. Yet, in European narratives, Africa was painted as a land of hunger, while in truth it sustained some of the earliest agricultural revolutions. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the ocean, endless blue, winds whipping, waves rising. Now imagine this: centuries before Columbus, before Vasco da Gama, before the so-called European Age of Discovery, Africans were already masters of the sea. In ancient Egypt, craftsmen tied together papyrus reeds into mighty ships. Many dismissed them as too fragile for oceans, until Thor, in the 20th century, built a replica called Ra. He sailed it across the Atlantic, proving what Egyptians already knew thousands of years ago. These vessels could cross oceans, now shift west, to the Empire of Mali, in the early 1300s. Emperor Abu Bakr II looked out across the Atlantic and asked a daring question: what lies beyond that horizon? He built a massive fleet, not just a few ships, but reportedly hundreds. Chronicles tell us he sailed with thousands of men, determined to find new lands. He never returned, but legends linger that his expedition reached the Americas long before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing. On the eastern shores of Africa, a different kind of ship ruled the seas, the dhow. Sleek wooden vessels with triangular sails, cutting swiftly across monsoon winds. Arab and Persian traders marveled at their speed and design. These same sails later inspired the European caravel, the very ship Columbus himself would use. And how did Africans guide themselves across such vast waters? By mastering the stars, by reading the winds, by learning the secret paths of the ocean currents. This wasn't chance, it was science, inherited through generations. So when Europe finally set out to discover the world, they weren't breaking new ground. They were following in the wake of African seafarers, the true sea kings, who had already charted the globe. Europe often claimed that Africans had no writing, yet the continent produced some of the earliest and most diverse systems of communication. In Egypt, hieroglyphics preserved complex history, from religious texts to records of science and politics. In Nubia, the Meroitic script flourished, showing a distinct written tradition that remains partly undeciphered even today. In West Africa, NCBD symbols encoded laws, stories, and trade, used by secret societies and communities for centuries. In Ethiopia, the GS script became the foundation of Amharic and Tigric, one of the world's oldest living written traditions, still in use, beyond writing. Africans also developed advanced communication systems. The talking drum, for example, could reproduce the tones of human speech and transmit messages across long distances. Villages, kingdoms, and armies relied on it as an early telecommunication network. Yet Europeans dismissed these innovations as primitive, refusing to recognize the intelligence and sophistication behind them. The story of African civilizations cannot be told without acknowledging their mastery of time, The ancient Egyptians created a solar calendar of 365 days, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 festival days. This system became the foundation for the Julian calendar of Rome, and later, the Gregorian calendar used worldwide, today. Their astronomical precision was not only for science, but also for farming cycles, religious rituals, and state organization. Ethiopia preserved its own calendar, one that still runs 7 years behind the Western system. This living tradition shows how Africans maintained an independent reckoning of time, resisting the idea that Europe defined universal standards. Across the continent, timekeeping tools reflected scientific creativity. Sundials measured the passage of daylight. Water clocks marked hours with flowing drops, and shadow markers aligned with solstices to track celestial movements. These innovations prove that Africans understood time with sophistication, long before Europe claimed to teach it to the world. Africa's military history is often told as one of defeat, yet the continent produced weapons and strategies that reshaped warfare itself. From the Noack culture of West Africa to the kingdom of Meru along the Nile, iron technology advanced early. Their tools and blades were sharper and more durable than anything Europe possessed for centuries, giving African armies a decisive edge. In southern Africa, the Zulu introduced the short stabbing spear known as the ikwe. Unlike long throwing spears, it was designed for close combat, forcing warriors into hand-to-hand encounters that overwhelmed traditional battle lines. This single innovation transformed the nature of African warfare in Ethiopia. Finely crafted swords and decorated shields were not only weapons, but also symbols of prestige. Arab traders and travelers recorded their admiration for Ethiopian craftsmanship and battlefield skill. When gunpowder weapons spread through trade, Africans adapted quickly. The famous Dahomey Amazons and elite corps of women soldiers wielded muskets with precision and discipline that struck fear into enemies and colonizers alike. These examples reveal a continent that was never technologically stagnant. African states built their own systems of military engineering, creating armies that were respected and feared. Yet in most history books, these achievements remain hidden, overshadowed by the narrative of conquest. Music is often considered art, but it is also science. Africa invented some of the world's most influential instruments. The banjo traces directly to West African string instruments. Drums with tension cords introduced adjustable pitch. Xylophones and mbiras created tonal patterns, later adopted in classical music, when enslaved Africans brought these instruments to the Americas. Europe rebranded them as Western creations, but their roots are deeply African. Some African innovations are so common today, we forget their origins. Shampoo and cosmetics were refined in ancient Egypt. Leather tanning in Morocco set global standards. Mining techniques in South Africa produced advanced tools. Glasswork, ceramics, and dyes were developed in workshops across the continent. Even chewing gum and cola nuts trace back to African origins, later commercialized by European companies. So how did all of this become European? Colonial powers and scholars deliberately erased African origins. Artifacts were stolen into European museums. African texts were translated but credited to Arabs or Greeks, even when explorers wrote about African achievements. Later historians ignored their words. Colonial education systems spread the lie that Africa contributed nothing, and by controlling textbooks, Europe controlled the world's memory. But the truth is rising again. Scholars, archaeologists, and African voices are restoring these stolen legacies. Universities are uncovering manuscripts from Timbuktu. Museums are being pressured to return artifacts, and African innovators are connecting ancient knowledge with modern science. The inventions Europe claimed are not dead relics. They are seeds. Seeds of pride, knowledge, and possibility for Africa's future. Africa was never a follower. Africa was always the beginning, the birthplace of humanity, the cradle of science, the mother of invention. Every corner of this continent whispers the truth, that the world we know today was shaped not in the castles of Europe, but in the valleys of the Nile, the deserts of the Sahara, and the kingdoms of West Africa. For centuries, these truths were buried, stolen, and renamed. But no matter how deep the erasure, light always finds its way back. And today, that light shines again. So when you hold a book, drink coffee, look at the stars, hear music, or measure time, remember, Africa was there first. Africa built, created, healed, discovered, and dreamed long before the world gave credit elsewhere. This is not just history, it is power. It is a reminder that Africa's children, across the world, carry within them a legacy of brilliance, a legacy no empire could erase. And now, it's our duty to tell these stories louder than ever, because the truth about Africa is not just for Africans, it belongs to all of humanity. If you believe this history must be heard, don't let it end here. Like this video, to keep Africa's voice strong. Share it so others can see the truth that was hidden. Comment your thoughts. Which invention surprised you most? And subscribe to Africa Untold. For more stories the world tried to erase, because history is not finished, and Africa's story is just beginning.